What happens when one of Hollywood's most enigmatic and uncompromising actors sits down on a live daytime talk show opposite one of its most outspoken and controversial hosts? On paper, it sounds like compelling television. In reality, it can turn into something far more volatile. That was exactly the atmosphere when Joaquin Phoenix made an appearance on The View. The long-running daytime panel show, known as much for its heated debates as for its celebrity interviews. From the moment Phoenix stepped onto the brightly lit set of The View, there was a perceptible shift in the room's energy. The applause from the studio audience was warm, but edged with curiosity. Phoenix is not a typical talk show guest. He is famously private, intensely introspective, and deeply committed to the causes he believes in. Unlike many actors who treat press tours as polished promotional routines, Phoenix often approaches interviews with a seriousness that can unsettle lighter formats. He had come to the show to discuss his latest project, documentary examining the realities of factory farming. A film that had already begun generating awards, buzz, and sparking difficult conversations. Phoenix's dedication to animal rights is not a recent publicity move or a fashionable Hollywood stance. It has been a lifelong commitment. Raised in a family that embraced veganism, he has spoken openly about the formative experiences that shaped his ethical beliefs. For him, advocacy is not separate from artistry. It informs the roles he chooses, the projects he supports, and the public platform he uses. So while the producers likely anticipated a thoughtful discussion about the documentary's message, they may not have anticipated just how quickly the tone would change. Seated across the table was Joy Behar, a veteran host known for her sharp wit, candid opinions, and willingness to challenge guests. Regular viewers understand her style. She often injects humor laced with skepticism, pushing back against narratives she finds exaggerated or self-righteous. Sometimes that approach leads to lively, engaging exchanges. Other times, it risks crossing into territory that feels dismissive. As the conversation began, it seemed routine enough. Phoenix spoke in measured tones about the documentary's goal: to shine a light on industrial farming practices and encourage viewers to think more critically about the origins of their food. He emphasized that the film was not meant to shame individuals, but to raise awareness about systemic issues. The audience listened attentively. The co-hosts nodded along. Then Joy leaned forward, her expression signaling a pivot. "I have to ask you about this whole vegan thing," she began, her voice carrying a familiar edge that longtime viewers instantly recognized. The phrasing alone hinted at skepticism. "I mean, come on," she continued, gesturing lightly with her hand. "Don't you think you're being a little dramatic about the whole meat industry. It's just food, right? The question hung in the air. For some in the audience, it may have sounded like a reasonable challenge. For others, it felt reductive. Phoenix shifted slightly in his chair, the movement subtle but telling. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in concentration. Anyone familiar with his public appearances knows that he does not treat his activism casually. For him, the topic is deeply personal. There was a pause before he responded, as though he were carefully choosing words that could both clarify his position and maintain composure. I wouldn't call exposing systematic cruelty to billions of sentient beings dramatic joy, he said evenly. I'd call it necessary. The calmness of his delivery contrasted with the intensity of his message. He did not raise his voice. He did not appear flustered. Instead, he spoke with quiet conviction. The word necessary seemed to echo more loudly than any heated retort might have. It reframed the debate from one about dietary preference to one about ethics. Joy leaned back slightly, perhaps surprised by the firmness of his response. But she pressed on, suggesting that many viewers might feel alienated by what they perceive as moral grandstanding. She questioned whether comparing meat consumption to cruelty risked oversimplifying complex agricultural systems. The exchange began to shift from promotional to philosophical. Phoenix listened without interrupting, though his posture remained tense. He explained that the documentary was grounded in documented practices, not hyperbole. He spoke about investigative footage, environmental impact studies, and the psychological discomfort society often feels when confronted with uncomfortable truths. For him, calling it just food ignored the broader implications: suffering, environmental degradation, and public health concerns. As the dialogue intensified, the rest of the panel appeared increasingly aware of the tightrope they were walking. The studio audience was quieter now, sensing the seriousness of the topic. This was no longer light, daytime banter. It was a debate about values, responsibility, and the power of media platforms. What made the moment particularly striking was not shouting or spectacle, but the clash of perspectives. Joy approached the subject with skepticism rooted in everyday pragmatism, food as culture, tradition, and personal choice. Phoenix approached it as a moral imperative, a systemic issue demanding urgent attention. Neither was willing to fully concede ground in live television. Such moments can either devolve into chaos or crystallize into meaningful discourse. The tension in the room suggested it could go either way. Producers likely monitored the exchange carefully, aware that passionate advocacy and sharp skepticism can quickly ignite controversy. For viewers at home, The scene was compelling, precisely because it felt unscripted. Phoenix's discomfort was visible, but so was his resolve. Joy's questions were pointed, but reflective of a segment of the audience that resists being told their everyday habits are harmful. The friction between them illuminated a broader cultural divide between activism that demands systemic change and skepticism that resists moral absolutism. By the time Phoenix reiterated that confronting cruelty is uncomfortable but essential, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. What began as a promotional stop had transformed into a live confrontation over ethics and responsibility. Whether one sided with Phoenix's uncompromising stance or Joy's pointed challenges, it was undeniable that the conversation had gone far beyond a simple discussion of a film. But surely you can see how normal people might find it a bit preachy. Her tone carried a mix of challenge and mock sympathy, as though she were positioning herself as the voice of the everyday viewer. I mean, my audience watches this show to relax, she added, gesturing toward the crowd. They're not tuning in to be lectured about their lunch choices. The comment drew a few uneasy chuckles from parts of the audience, but the overall atmosphere had shifted. What had begun as a pointed question was now morphing into a broader dismissal of the issue itself. Around the table, the other co-hosts could sense the tension escalating. Whoopi Goldberg shifted in her seat, her expression tightening as she prepared to step in. Sarah N. glanced between the two, visibly aware that the exchange was teetering on the edge of something more volatile. Whoopi attempted to interject with a measured tone. I think there's room for different perspectives here, she began diplomatically, her voice calm but firm. People care about different issues for different reasons, but Joy wasn't finished. She waved her hand slightly, cutting across the attempt at moderation. Look, she said, turning back toward Phoenix. I respect your passion, I really do. Yet, the phrasing felt hollow, undercut by the sharpness in her delivery. But, don't you think there are bigger problems in the world than worrying about chicken nuggets? We've got wars happening. We've got poverty, climate crises, political chaos, and you're focused on cows, eh? The words were framed as pragmatic realism, but they landed like provocation. The suggestion that concern for animal welfare was trivial compared to global crises simplified a complex argument into a rhetorical punchline. For Phoenix, whose advocacy is deeply intertwined with environmental concerns and social responsibility, the dismissal seemed to strike a nerve. His jaw tightened visibly. The camera, unflinching, captured the subtle shift in his posture. His hands, which had rested calmly in his lap moments earlier, slowly curled into fists. He didn't interrupt her mid-sentence. Instead, he waited for the brief pause that followed her comment, then leaned slightly forward. His voice measured but firm. "Joy, with all due respect," he began, the phrase careful but edged, "factory. Farming is one of the leading contributors to climate change." His eyes locked onto hers, not aggressively, but with unwavering intensity. "It's responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transportation sector in certain global estimates. So, when you ask if there are bigger problems, you're actually talking about the same problem." The studio grew quieter still. The audience sensed that this was no longer about personal dietary choices. It was about interconnected systems, environmental degradation, resource consumption, and ethical responsibility. Phoenix wasn't presenting his stance as a moral superiority. He was framing it as a matter of documented impact. Joy let out a short, dismissive laugh, waving her hand as if brushing away an exaggeration. "Oh, come on," she said. "That's just activist talking points. You can't seriously believe that eating a hamburger is going to destroy the planet." Of his argument to a single hamburger felt intentional, a rhetorical strategy to make the broader claim seem absurd. The camera returned to Phoenix, and viewers could see the transformation unfolding in real time. The calm, contemplative demeanor he had carried into the studio was giving way to something more intense, controlled, but unmistakably charged. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier, but infused with conviction. "Joy," he said carefully, "I've spent years researching this. I've visited these facilities. I've seen the conditions firsthand. This isn't about one hamburger. It's about an industry that operates on a scale most people never see." His emphasis was not theatrical. It was personal. He described the overcrowded barns, the environmental runoff contaminating waterways, the methane emissions from industrial livestock operations. He spoke about workers in those facilities, many of whom faced dangerous conditions and limited protections. For him, the issue wasn't isolated, it was tied to public health, climate stability, and ethical consumption. Around the table, the other hosts remained attentive, perhaps recognizing that the conversation had reached a pivotal moment. Whoopi nodded slightly, acknowledging the gravity of what was being said. Sarah watched intently, her expression thoughtful rather than combative. Joy, however, appeared unconvinced. "But you can't expect everyone to overhaul their lives overnight," she countered. "People are struggling to pay bills. Sometimes a chicken nugget is just a chicken nugget." The comment reflected a pragmatic worldview, prioritizing accessibility and immediate concerns over systemic reform. But Phoenix didn't retreat. "I'm not asking for perfection," he replied. "I'm asking for awareness, for accountability from corporations, for incremental change that adds up. His voice remained steady, but the edge lingered. Dismissing it as preachy makes it easier to ignore. The tension in the studio was palpable now. Not explosive, but electric. Viewers could feel the ideological divide. One perspective emphasizing relatability and comfort, the other urgency and responsibility. Neither side appeared willing to concede, yet both were articulating viewpoints held by millions outside the studio walls. Phoenix's expression, intense and unwavering, conveyed more than frustration. It conveyed fatigue, the weariness of repeatedly defending a cause he believes should be self-evident. "When you've seen what I've seen," he added quietly, "it's hard to stay silent." The simplicity of that statement carried more impact than statistics. It shifted the tone from abstract debate to personal testimony. For a brief moment, even joy seemed to pause. The rhythm of her retort interrupted by the sincerity in his voice. Live television thrives on moments like these, unscripted, raw, unpredictable. Yet what made this exchange compelling wasn't volume or spectacle. It was conviction meeting skepticism in real time. It was a debate about whether advocacy belongs in entertainment spaces and whether discomfort is an acceptable byproduct of awareness. As the segment edged toward its time limit, producers likely weighed whether to pivot the conversation back to the documentary itself. But by then, the promotional aspect had become secondary. What viewers were witnessing was a broader cultural conversation distilled into a single table. The tension between comfort and conscience, between dismissing concerns as exaggerated and acknowledging their systemic roots. Phoenix sat upright, his fists gradually unclenching, though his intensity remained. Joy adjusted her papers, preparing, perhaps, for another counterpoint. Around them, the panel and audience remained alert, aware that something significant had unfolded, not a shouting match, but a collision of worldviews under studio lights. In the end, the exchange underscored how deeply intertwined issues like factory farming, climate change, and consumer habits have become in public discourse. For some, it may have felt like an unwelcome lecture during a daytime show. It was a necessary disruption, a reminder that even casual spaces can become platforms for urgent conversations.